which is not bad. Yeah.
Mhm.
So Chiti, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Devika. So I'm very happy to introduce today Dr. Sahas Barve, who is currently the John W. Fitzpatrick Director of Avian Ecology at the Archbold Biological Station in Florida, where he studies this cool bird known as the Florida scrub jay, among several other birds. He did his master's from the Wildlife Institute of India, followed by a PhD from Cornell University. And this was followed by a postdoctorate at the Old Dominion University. And he also had a stint at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History as a Peter Buck Fellow. He has done a lot of research on several different kinds of birds, including the life history strategies and ecophysiology and diverse adaptations of birds, especially in high elevation montane forests with respect to cold and hypoxic environments. And he's also involved in a lot of behavior-related research work on birds, including the cooperative behavior in acorn woodpeckers, as well as the Florida scrub jays. And apart from all this research, Sahas is also a great mentor and does a lot of outreach as well. And if you haven't seen the video on YouTube yet, Sah has done a really cool video, a biod video on how a bird expert answers bird tweets from Twitter. So if you haven't got that, please watch that as well on YouTube. And over to you now, Sahas.
Thank you so much, Chiti, for that wonderful introduction, very generous introduction. So hello, everyone. My name is Sahas Barve. And yeah, like Chiti said, I work at the Archbold Biological Station. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
And it's in full screen, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So okay. So today I'm going to talk about one quick warning is Chiti or Devika, I can't see the chat because I'm on a single screen right now. And so if there is a question, please just jump in and flag it. Okay. So great. So I'm here to talk today about small birds on big mountains in thin air and cold weather. And this is a combination of research that I've done over the last now about a decade, spanning through my PhD and one of my postdocs. So let's begin by me telling you who I am and a little bit about myself so that I'm just not this voice coming to you from somewhere. I grew up in a, hold on, oops. Maybe I was on the last slide. There we go. Okay, now it should work. So I grew up in a quaint little town, sleepy little town called Mumbai in India. But I was always that kid that despite living in a big city, I was always fascinated by wildlife, and I was a bird watcher. And my spark bird, as they say, was a Brahmi kite, which I saw when I was in 6th or 7th standard, and was fascinated by birds ever since. And by the time I was done with my master's in wildlife sciences from the Wildlife Institute of India, I'd had the great privilege of working in several amazing landscapes across India. So I'd had the great chance of working on foxes in the Indian desert, on rhinos and tigers in Kaziranga. I led a telemetry project on king cobras in the Western Ghats. And just before I came to the US for my PhD, I finally did some really amazing bird work with Chiti's advisor, Robin, on endemic birds in the Shola habitats of the southern Western Ghats. So all that field experience basically led me to sort of further solidify my conviction and believe that evolution and ecology are inextricably linked to each other, right? That evolutionary history of a species often constrains ecology of that species, and species that have very similar ecologies often, or species that have very similar ecologies have very convergent evolution towards convergent morphology or convergent physiology. And this back and forth between evolution and ecology is something that we are going to explore today. My current research, as Chiti said, is sort of along two axes of the number of species and spatial scope at one end and temporal scope at the other end. So today I'm going to talk to you about this multi-species large temporal scope approach, where I use sometimes hundreds of species to understand how evolution happens and how morphology of birds specifically evolves across millions of years of shared evolutionary history across hundreds of species. On the other hand of this spectrum, I study a single species across a very small spatiotemporal scope to understand how very local factors drive the evolution of behaviors and ecology. So that's the part of research where I do a lot of behavioral research on acorn woodpeckers and Florida scrub jays, and that may be a topic for a chat at another time. All right. So with that, let's go to the Himalayas, which I'm sure all of you know is the highest mountain range in the world. And this is a photo from one of my favorite places on Earth, which is the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve, and specifically Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. So why are mountains so special with regards to birds? Well, this is a heat map of all the places that birds live in the world. And so the darker the region, the more species live there. And as you can see, bird species are found everywhere. Birds are found everywhere, even in the middle of the deepest ocean, right? So the Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the Earth is somewhere here. And yet there are about 20 species of birds that live on the open ocean out there. But what is most obvious about this figure from BirdLife International is that mountains are where the most birds live in the world. So if you look at this map very closely, you can see that the Himalayas light up. So this is not a map of geographic features. This is a map of just how many species there are per 10,000 square kilometers of land. And you can see that the Himalayas light up, the outline of the Himalayas lights up completely. That's the same with the Andes. So you can see those two ridges of the Andes, and then which becomes a single ridge here. You can see the mountains of Mexico and Central America. You can see the mountains of the Central Rift Valley in Africa. Mountains are just full of birds. So why is that? Like, on the one hand, mountains are potentially very unforgiving habitats, right? They're cold, they're windy, they're very often very dry. Why does it happen that mountains around the world have been colonized over and over again by a very high diversity of birds? So one way that all those species sort of fit on a mountain is a pattern which is a recurrent pattern, again, all across the world, called elevational species replacement. And this pattern, although I'm going to talk to you about birds today, is a pattern that plays again and again with any taxon that you study. It is true for mosses, it is true for plants, it is true for bugs, it is true for reptiles, it's true for anything that is alive. At low elevations, there is a species that gets replaced by a very closely related other species at higher elevations, such that multiple closely related species often replace each other along the elevational gradient. Okay, so along mountainsides, species occur in elevational bands, and those species are then replaced by a closely related species at higher elevation. This is what we are going to call elevational species replacement. To give you a quick example that this pattern is worldwide, let's take a quick example of two tits that are found in the northern part of New York State. So Adirondacks National Park is a very famous place in the US, and there you have two species of tits: the black cap chickadee at low elevations and boreal chickadee at high elevations, where the boreal chickadee replaces the black cap chickadee with elevation. If you go to the Himalayas, of course, we have much higher diversity in the Himalayas than upstate New York. And so we have 6 species, or even actually, if you think of all the birds, maybe even 7 species of tits that replace each other along the elevational gradient. So you have cinereous tits at the bottom of the mountain, and that they go up to about 1500 meters, which is replaced by greenback tits, and gray crested tits, or rufous vented tits are potentially the highest living tits in the Himalayas. So you have this beautiful replacement of species across the elevation gradient. You can see the same pattern in other groups of birds, like sunbirds. So in the Himalayas, again, this is in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary where I did my PhD. We have purple sunbirds at the bottom of the mountain and fire-tailed sunbirds at the top of the mountain. And again, this just, you can keep repeating this pattern with every family of birds that you study. Okay? The other really cool thing about the Himalayas in particular, and I think the Himalayas are very special in this regard, is that the birds that live in the Himalayas have very diverse evolutionary histories. So, as I'm sure you know, the Himalayas were formed by the Indian plate crashing into the Eurasian plate. And so because of that, the Himalayas are still growing, and it's basically a huge mountain range that has come about with the Tibetan plateau on the north, and the fertile valleys of the Ganga, Yamuna, and Brahmaputra in the south. And so once these high elevation habitats were created about 20 to 30 million years ago, a bunch of different animals started colonizing Himalayas from all over. And so you have birds that colonize the Himalayas from the northwest, from the much more colder regions of Asia. And these species include families like nuthatches and finches and thrushes and chickadees or tits. But you also had species that colonized the Himalayas from the southeast, from Southeast Asia. These were animals like bulbuls and flycatchers and fantails and white eyes. And so Himalayan bird communities today are a wonderful admixture of species that evolved very far away from each other, in isolation from each other, but now have evolved to live in the same community together, and have evolved adaptations to survive in high cold hypoxic regions. So with that little preamble, let me, Devika, is it okay to ask a few questions just to make sure that our audience has a pulse? Devika or Chiti, can I ask a quick, well, whoever's
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, whoever's listening, and so what happens when you are cold? What is the behavior, or what does your physiology do when you're cold? And so let's try to understand that, to understand why being cold, especially on mountains, is dangerous, difficult. Okay, Karnika says energy conservation. Shivering, Tanu says shivering. Absolutely right. Anything else? What happens when you're cold? Thermogenesis. Great. So energy loss, absolutely. So let's take what Tanu and Ramaswamy are saying there. Okay. So Tanu says that we are shivering, and that's absolutely right. Adult humans don't have what is called brown fat, and hence we need, and Govind Sundaram also says higher metabolism. That's absolutely also right. So I'm sure if you watched Anusha's talk yesterday, then I'm sure she has primed me really well to explain some concepts here. And so there is obviously shivering, and so what happens when you start shivering? How do you shiver? What is the mechanism by which you shiver? I suddenly can't see the chat anymore. Let me go out. Chat. Regulated by thyroid hormones. Muscle movement. Ramaswamy said muscle movement. Perfect. Okay. So shivering is basically rapid contraction of muscles, right? And those muscles are contracting across our body. So what do muscles need to contract? Yes, perfect. So what do muscles need to contract? Energy. Great. How is energy? What do we need to produce energy? What do we need to produce ATP? Food and glucose, more food, and what? Water, oxygen. Someone said oxygen. Sunlight. We don't really need sunlight for energy production. But at least us, heterotrophs like us. But Neeraj A said oxygen, and that's absolutely right. And so we need food and oxygen to produce energy, right? And at high elevation, that oxygen is in short supply. And so being cold at high elevations is especially dangerous because you need oxygen consumption to produce the energy to stay warm, but oxygen is in short supply. And so you may want to increase your metabolism, like Ponraj said, but you cannot increase your metabolism or metabolic rate to produce energy, to produce heat in your body, because you're just in an oxygen deficient system. Okay, so that's why I was really interested in these two topics that I'm going to talk to you about. Okay, so that's sort of my talk outline today. I'm going to talk about hypoxia and talk about temperature and how temperature affects how hypoxia and temperature drive evolution of morphology and physiology in Himalayan birds. So let's start with hypoxia, which is just a good another way of saying low partial pressure of oxygen or just low availability of oxygen. Okay, so this paper came out in 2016. It's called it's in ProcP, and you guys can go read it later if you want. But all the research for this talk happened in this place, in the Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, and there's a great view of the Western Himalayas from Kedarnath. So while I'm taking this photo, I'm standing at the Tungnath temple, which is the highest Shiva temple in the world. And if you don't know where Kedarnath is, it's in the Garhwal region of Uttarakhand, in Chamoli district of Uttarakhand. And I was really interested in hyperbaric hypoxia or just hypoxia because unlike temperature, hypoxia is a constant feature all around the world. It is not affected by temperature. It is not affected by latitude. So even if you are on the tallest mountain in Antarctica, which is Vinson Massif, you will still be have the same hypoxia as the elevation of Vinson Massif is anywhere else in the world. Okay, so at 10,000 feet in the Himalayas, you have the same amount of oxygen as 10,000 feet in Antarctica. And because this is a constant feature around the world, hypoxia is a problem that has been overcome multiple times, right? So animals all around the world have independently overcome hypoxia. So animals like llamas in South America, yaks in North America, yaks in Asia, my bad, deer in North America, and these bar-headed geese also in Asia have all independently evolved to overcome the harmful effects of hypoxia. Not only that, the three different independent colonizations of high elevations by humans have led to three completely different sort of adaptations for overcoming hypoxia in humans itself. So the three populations of humans, the Ethiopians or Abyssinian population, the Tibetan population, and the Andean population of South America, all show very, very distinct ways in which they cope with hypoxia. Okay, so to understand how birds do it, let's take a quick historical detour. This is a rather high mountain in the Himalayas called Mount Everest, and some people say it's the highest mountain in the world. And this was scaled by these two gentlemen, Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. So Edmund Hillary was a lowlander, and he was born in a place called Auckland. He lived in Auckland, and he kept honeybees as a source of income, and lived at sea level in the coastal town of Auckland for about 6 months of the year, and then went to the Himalayas to climb mountains for the rest of the 6 months. So he spent the austral summers, which is our winter, in warm Auckland, and then spent the boreal summers in warm Nepal. As opposed to this, Sherpa Tenzing Norgay was a Sherpa, which means that he was from the Khumbu region, which is in the border area of Nepal and China. And so Tenzing Norgay was a Highlander and lived a huge chunk of his life at high elevation. So he was born in a village that is about 10,000 feet above sea level. And so he was living in hypoxic conditions for a huge chunk of his life. Just like Sherpa Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary, there are two types of birds that live in the Himalayas. One that we're going to call Hillary robins live at low elevations for about 6 months of the year, and then go to high elevations to breed for about 4 to 6 months of the year. And then there are birds that live at high elevations for the whole year, and let's call them Tenzing bush tits. Okay, so these Hillary robins or elevational migrants go back and forth between living in oxygen-rich environments and oxygen-poor environments for about 6 months of the year, while these Tenzing bush tits or high elevation residents live in oxygen-poor environments all year round. And so my question then was, does elevational migration pattern, so elevational migration or the lack thereof, predict how these birds are responding to hypoxia? And so throughout this part of the talk, when I'm going to talk about Hillary robins or elevational migrants, I'm going to be talking about 9 species of elevational migrants. And when I talk about high elevation residents or Tenzing bush tits, I'm going to talk about 6 different species that I studied. Okay. So again, there are many ways in which animals overcome hypoxia. The most common way, and potentially the most plastic way of doing that, is what is called the erythropoietic response, which is regulation of blood O2 carrying capacity through the proliferation of red blood cells. And this is a response that you and I show also. And not only you and I, but almost all vertebrates in the world show the same pattern, where if you take a vertebrate animal to a high elevation habitat, they increase the number of red blood cells in their body, like someone had said in the chat already, to increase the amount of hemoglobin in their blood. And this hemoglobin is a wonderful molecule that binds to oxygen and then transports that oxygen to our cells. Okay, so this response, where we increase the hemoglobin concentration by increasing the number of red blood cells in our body, we are going to call the lowlander response or the ancestral response. Okay, and I call it the ancestral response because it's so widespread, but also because it's a little problematic. So you can keep increasing the number of red blood cells in your blood, but beyond a point, what happens is the viscosity of blood, because the blood is so full of hemoglobin red blood cells, the viscosity of blood increases to a concentration where it becomes inefficient to pump that thick blood through your system. So this is an exaggeration, of course, but it's like pumping tomato ketchup versus blood, right? So if the blood is really thick, then the time it takes to circulate through your body it goes down, and thus the amount of oxygen that is being supplied to your tissues also goes down. So having very high hematocrit is actually is bad. Above a certain point, hematocrit can be maladaptive. And because that's true, a lot of species that live at high elevations and oxygen-poor environments all their life have ways other than increasing their hematocrit, and there are other ways of increasing hemoglobin also, which they have evolved. And so this is what we are going to call the Highlander or adaptive response. Physical and biochemical changes in addition to increasing hemoglobin concentration without increasing the hematocrit, and thus having very viscous blood. So I studied hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit in 15 species of Himalayan birds found between 1,000 meters and 3,500 meters in the Western Himalayas. And this is a quick phylogeny of how they were related to each other. In my sample, I had tits, laughing thrushes, leaf warblers, thrushes, and flycatchers. We caught birds using conventional bird catching techniques called mist netting, and I had 3 predictions. The first is that hemoglobin concentration increases along a species' elevational distribution. So I hope you remember that we talked about how species on mountains are distributed along elevational bands. And so there are some individuals of the species that live at low elevations and some individuals of the same species that live at the upper elevational extent for that species. And my prediction was that those birds that live at low elevations or the lower limit have low hemoglobin concentration. Birds that live at high limit have high hemoglobin concentration within the same species. My prediction was that these high elevation residents, because they live in oxygen poor environments all year round, are better adapted to those environments and show a weak correlation between hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit, because they don't want that high hematocrit and the bad side effects of that. While elevational migrants show hematocrit with high hemoglobin concentration. So this is a very plastic response. You and I show it. As soon as we go to the high elevations, we start making more red blood cells, right? And so basically that's what these high elevation, so elevational migrants, are doing. Every time they go to high elevations to breed, they increase their hematocrit by increasing, they increase their hematocrit and hence increase their hemoglobin concentration. Okay, so let's look at some results. So measuring the hemoglobin concentration is actually pretty easy. You get this really handy monitor that you can just take a little bit of blood from the bird and stick it into the monitor, and it tells you the hemoglobin concentration. And for hematocrit, you need to spin the blood down to separate the plasma from the red blood cells to understand what is the volume of those two things. So hemoglobin concentration, we saw increased in both high elevation residents and elevational migrants. And so going back to that first prediction that I had, hemoglobin concentration does in fact increase within a species. So individuals of the same species living at low elevations had on average lower hemoglobin concentration, and individuals of the same species at higher elevations, and you can look at these dark blue dots here, had higher hemoglobin concentration. Okay, so within the same species, hemoglobin is changing across its elevational distribution. We did see that high elevation residents, or those Tenzing bush tits, showed a weak correlation between hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit. So they had high hemoglobin concentration, but did not have the high hematocrit, which makes their blood viscous. While those elevation migrants, or Hillary Robbins, showed the predicted strong correlation between hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit. So they were increasing their hemoglobin concentration and hence increasing the amount of oxygen they were absorbing by increasing the number of red blood cells in their blood. So of course, the question then is, how do you increase your hemoglobin concentration, which these Tenzing bush tits were doing, without increasing the number of red blood cells in your blood? And that is a really cool adaptation called increased MCHC, or increased mean cellular hemoglobin concentration, MCHC. Okay, and so basically what that means is that in these high elevation birds, you have each red blood cell just packed with more molecules of hemoglobin than the red blood cells of these elevation migrants. So they just have more hemoglobin per red blood cell. And so this is really interesting because it's a great example of convergent evolution, where elevational movement or their ecology is actually driving differences in their physiological adaptations. So like I said, these high elevation residents had 2 species of warblers, 2 species of laughing thrush, 1 species of laughing thrush, and they had very similar or closely related birds that were also elevational migrants. So it wasn't evolutionary ancestry that drives physiological adaptations, but it is in fact your ecology. So two warblers that are very closely related to each other, but have these different ecologies of one being high elevation residents and one being an elevation migrant, are showing completely different physiology, which is driven by their movement ecology and not by their evolutionary history. So tits and laughing thrushes that are elevational residents, high elevation residents, are more close to each other in their physiology than those two laughing thrushes where one is a high elevation resident and one is an elevation migrant. Okay, so all I'm trying to say is that physiology is convergent across Himalayan birds, and life history drives this convergence of physiology. And this potentially has very strong implications for how Himalayan birds are going to react to climate change, right? So this is just a very simple graph of how many species are found at different elevations at different times of the year. And so in the same landscape where we did this study. So as you can see, at low elevations, about 1,500 meters, at any time of the year, you have about 150 species that you can see. But if you go to the really high elevations in the same landscape, you can see that in the summer, there are about 100 species that you can see. But in the winter, there are only about 30 species. And so this means that there are about 70 species of birds that are elevationally migrating to these areas in the summer. Okay. And so you can then imagine that if everyone is moving upslope with climate warming, that these tenzing bush states or high elevation residents are going to be constrained by how much hemoglobin they can pack into each of those red blood cells without making the red blood cells too large to go through their capillaries. Versus these Hillary robins or elevational migrants, as they try to move up in elevation also, they are going to be constrained by how much hematocrit they can have without making their blood too viscous to circulate. And so it is very important, especially in very high elevation habitats like the Himalayas, to understand how hypoxia physiology is going to drive the response of Himalayan birds to climate change. So with that, let me see what the time is. Let me come to the next part of the talk, unless there are some very burning questions that I need to answer. And Neeraj, we can get to your question later at the end, if you don't mind. Okay, so let's move to the next part of the talk and talk about the second abiotic factor which changes with elevation, and that is temperature. Right. So I think you already know this. I'm sorry I didn't mention this before, but we know that temperature changes systematically with elevation, right? So temperature and oxygen availability changes with elevation. And as you can see in this photo, the top of this mountain is significantly colder than the bottom of this mountain, right? The top of the mountain has a lot of snow. The bottom of the mountain does not have a lot of snow. And on huge elevational gradients like the Himalayas, you can see this transition in one side, but also you can walk through a number of amazing habitats going through the elevation distribution of multiple species of plants and animals. And so in one really long day of walking, you can go from cold alpine tundra at 13,000 feet down to subtropical forests at about 5,000 feet. But between those habitats, you have a gradation of a number of different habitats, and you pass through the entire elevation distribution of a number of different species. The cool thing about Himalayas is that each of those species is predicted or expected to be adapted uniquely to the conditions that are found in its own elevational band, right? And this sort of was really sort of, it struck me because of one observation that I'd made of this bird called a gold crest. And this single observation actually was the inspiration for the study that I'm going to describe to you in a few minutes. So let me tell you what happened. So I was in the Himalayas during doing my PhD field research in 2014, and I was covered. It was about -10 degrees Celsius, which is a cold day in the Himalayas, but not especially cold for the elevation I was at, which is about 10,000 feet. So I was at about 3,000 meters, and I was really interested in understanding how high elevation resident birds survive in that cold, or how they forage in the cold. So I was really interested in how birds at those elevations use their habitat. And so I was out in the forest trying to make recordings and record the foraging behavior of birds in oak forests. So I got ready. Wore every jacket and every piece of long underwear I had, and I walked out into the forest. And then for the first half hour, I didn't really see any birds. And so I was getting a little disappointed by how few birds I was seeing. And then I suddenly heard this chip sound that I knew very well. And I looked up into the spruce tree that was next to me, and I saw this little ball of fluff. This species is called the gold crest. The Latin name is Regulus regulus, and it's a bird. It's a genus that's found across North America and Eurasia. As soon as I saw this bird, I was excited to finally get some data for my PhD. And I took my hand out of my glove and started making notes while observing the bird. But almost within seconds of me taking my hand out of my mitten, my hand froze and became so numb that I couldn't write anymore. And that's when it struck me. This bird that I was watching is about 6 grams in weight. Okay, so 6 grams is 1 teaspoon of sugar. I weigh about 65,000 grams. And despite 3 orders of magnitude difference in our body weight, this bird was surviving that cold -10 morning much better than me. I couldn't even take my hand out of my mitten for a few seconds, and this bird was going about its daily business like nothing was wrong. Let me put that further into perspective. Birds typically maintain their hearts at about 40 degrees Celsius. Okay, the distance between the outside air, which was at -10 degrees Celsius, and its heart, which was at 40 degrees Celsius, was maybe at the most 1.5 or 2 centimeters. Okay, and it was this. So this bird was maintaining this 50 degrees C difference across a 2 centimeter gradient, which is absolutely crazy. If birds dip their core temperature to about 37, 36 degrees Celsius, unless they're in torpor, they go into hypothermic shock and can die. And so this tiny bird, 6-gram bird, was maintaining a 40 degrees C heart all day, every day, throughout winter. And that just completely blew my mind. What it was doing while it was foraging was doing exactly this. It wasn't a nice aerodynamic shape, but it had become a ball of feathers. And I wanted to study how the goldcrest's feathers are helping it stay warm. So to understand that, let's quickly look at how do birds stay warm. So birds have an outside layer of feathers, which is a great energy efficient way of staying warm because you don't have to expend energy. The feathers are exactly like jackets. They insulate you. They insulate your body heat from the outside air. So you're not losing body heat to the outside air and thus staying warm. But of course, like we talked about earlier, whenever that outside layer is not enough, whenever I'm sure you've been out in a place where it is cold and you're not wearing a sweater, that's when you start ramping up your metabolic rate, start shivering, producing heat to keep warm. But again, as we talked about, this way of producing body heat by shivering is very energy intensive. And so birds across the world have come up with a variety of adaptations, both behavioral adaptations and physiological adaptations, to try to minimize the energy expenditure that they have. Okay, so they show many behaviors like these European bee eaters showing what is called huddling, but it should actually be called cuddling. But a lot of animals also store food or just migrate to other warmer places. Today, now we are going to talk about feathers. So I'm sure you're all interested in ornithology, but assuming that that nobody has talked to you about feathers yet, let me tell you a little bit about feathers and do some feathers feather 101. I'm sorry, this. Anyway, so most birds have three kinds of feathers. They have wing feathers, they have tail feathers, and they have what are called contour or body feathers. Okay, and these contour or body feathers cover about 90% of the bird's body, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We're not going to focus on wing or tail feathers. So let's look at one of those contour feathers in more closely. And here's a contour feather of a, I think this is a herring gull contour feather. And you can see that the base of that contour feather, just like the base of this red-tailed hawk feather here, is very fuzzy, and it's made up of these non-interlocking barbs. And those are called downy barbs. Okay, so those downy barbs are the insulative part of the feather. So those downy barbs actually capture and hold heat close to the bird's body and help with insulation. The distal end of this feather are made up of interlocking barbs called pennaceous barbs. And those pennaceous barbs, because they're interlocking, are the waterproof part of the feather. But they're also the colorful part of the feather. So these are all pennaceous barbs. The colorful part of the feather is the pennaceous barbs. And pennaceous barbs are what you see on the outside of the bird. So that's a closer look at pennaceous barbs that interlock with each other, and these plumulaceous or downy barbs that are non-interlocking. So the prediction in the literature was this insulating part of the body feather should be bigger in birds that live in cold areas. So the proportion of the feather that is made up of this downy region should be greater in birds that live in cold habitats. And a quick and dirty example of that are these two owls. The burrowing owl lives in very warm habitats. This feather of a burrowing owl comes from San Diego, California, which is a very warm place, versus this feather of a Arctic living snowy owl, of course, that lives in very cold habitat. And as you can see, the downy part of the burrowing owl feather is very small versus the downy part of this snowy owl, which is very big. The other thing birds can do is not just increase the downy part of each feather, but also just make each feather longer. Okay, so when you have many feathers that overlap each other, you can create a deeper and downier plumage. And so feather length is a plumage level adaptation, and increasing the amount of down in your feathers is a sort of feather level adaptation. So I wanted to study whether across a very small spatial extent, which is the base of the mountain to the top of the mountain, right? So if the base of the mountain is at 5,000 feet and top mountain is 13,000 feet, that's barely a mile in a little more than a mile in physical distance. So I was really interested in understanding whether feather adaptations to cold can arise across such a small spatial scale. And I was also interested in understanding this with Himalayan birds, because like we talked about, they have these amazing, distinct evolutionary histories. So I was really interested in whether birds that evolved in temperate, cold regions of the world show different feather adaptations than birds that evolved in the tropics. And so I studied feather structure, the proportion of down in Himalayan birds. I was interested in whether temperate and tropical taxa show differences in their feather adaptations. And because small body-sized birds lose heat much faster than large body-sized birds, and that is just Newton's second law of cooling, I guess. So because small birds have a much bigger surface area. They have a much bigger rate of heat loss, whether they are more insulated than large birds. So I did this by studying bird specimens at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where I brought in specimens into the lab and took a photo of a bird specimen. And here I'm photographing some beautiful long-tailed minivet specimens. Under a microscope, I isolated a contour feather, and so you can see the pennaceous part of that minivet feather here on my screen. The red part that you see, but the downy part of the same feather is gray. Okay. And so I measured a bunch of different variables. Here is a photo of a wren babbler feather where you can see the downy part and the pennaceous part. And then I did that for about 1,700 specimens for about 2,500 feathers and 249 species of birds. I mapped all those traits onto a molecular phylogeny of these birds that was created by Trevor Price, and conducted some phylogenetic multivariate generalized least squares to test my hypotheses. So what I found was that both tropical and temperate high elevation birds have more insulated feathers. So it did not matter where you evolved. Now that you live in cold areas, irrespective of whether you're a temperate or tropical bird, if you live at high elevations, you have more downy feathers. Okay. Relative feather length, or just that in layering of feathers on top of each other, is not driven by elevation, but is in fact driven by body size. And so small birds have longer feathers. And so if you compare the feathers of a tit versus the feather of a thrush, a tit has a disproportionately longer body feather than a thrush, which means that it is better insulated. So as you go up in body size, you go down in how insulative your feathers are. And because we found these patterns across 250 species of birds, we think that this is a general pattern in birds all around the world. Whenever you put birds at high elevations, you get birds that have more downy feathers and also small birds that have longer feathers. And we sort of tested this hypothesis on a completely different bird that has, or a couple of birds that have evolved in the Santa Marta Mountains in northern Colombia, right? So completely different evolutionary origins. And we found very similar patterns. So we within these two species, we saw that the birds that live at higher elevations had longer feathers than the birds that live at low elevations. And so I hope I have convinced you that birds do a number of really cool things. They have adapted to really extreme hypoxia, and they can survive some really cold weather that even we can't. And so next time when you see a bird all fluffed up, you know what exactly it is doing. It is using its feathers to trap a bunch of air to stay warm, to reduce the energy that it expends, and hence require less oxygen to survive. So I'm really, in general, I'm really interested in avian thermoregulation and how birds use their feathers and metabolism to stay warm. And now before I moved to Florida, I finished this really cool project where we are looking at how bird feathers may help them stay warm. So not only do birds have this insulative layer, but the color you are also drives the amount of heat you can absorb from incident solar radiation, right? So from the sun, we know that when you wear a black shirt, you get much more hot than when you wear a white shirt. And so are birds affected by similar things? We don't know. And so now we have some really cool data from looking at how much energy is absorbed by these birds to understand how does feather color affect heat absorption in Himalayan birds. So more on that maybe sometime soon. Again, I hope you've learned a little bit more about how birds survive physiological challenges of living at high elevations in hypoxic weather and cold temperatures. And with that, I would like to thank the National Geographic Society, NSF, the Wildlife Institute of India, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the Smithsonian Museum, Cornell University, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Hi, Sahas. So there are some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So the first one was by Sachin regarding, it's on the slide with the density
Yes.
map.
Yes. So how? Why do
European
elevation?
mountains. No, I think before that there's one
Before
on European mountains are not showing the density as expected.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, it's because European mountains just don't have that much diversity. So they well, tropical mountains typically have more bird diversity than temperate mountains, and European mountains are also not that high, and so you don't get that same stacking of species one on top of each other like you do in the Andes and the Himalayas. So does that answer your question, Sachin? Yes, I hope so. Um, so can we take some of these other questions then, Devika? I can stop sharing also so I can.
There are a
Oh, I can't hear.
There are a couple of questions from Neeraj regarding the physiology part. Do birds have 2,3 DPG? Does hemoglobin here impart color? And what is the effect on erythropoietin?
Okay, so yes, the hemoglobin does. Oh, hold on. Let me read that question. Does hemoglobin impart color to the blood? Yes, hemoglobin does impart color to the blood, and it is the exact same hemoglobin alpha and hemoglobin beta molecules that we have. So hemoglobin is a conserved molecule across vertebrates, and so your hemoglobin and the bird's hemoglobin is very similar in chemical makeup and how it works in binding to oxygen. So let's go to the next one. How do elevation migrant birds move towards a mountain area with low oxygen, which may impact their energy budget? And if they are moving there to breed specifically, it also against the philosophy of providing a comfortable environment for the offspring for survival. Yeah, that's a great question, Sachin, and that's sort of the $1 million question that I'm really interested in answering. And so, why would you want to go into and breed in a place that is much more physiologically challenging and do one of the most energy expensive behaviors you can do, which is breeding, right? So when birds are breeding, they have to expend a lot of energy incubating eggs and feeding the chicks. And so why do that? And so one of the hypotheses that is currently very popular is that high elevation habitats typically have much lower predation pressure than low elevation habitats. And so these birds are sort of living at these high elevation habitats because they just survive better. And their chicks survive better in those elevations than at low elevations. And so it's always a trade-off. Like anything in ecology, it is always a trade-off. There's either you're always trying to overcome something that is happening and you have a price to pay. So every adaptation has a trade-off, just like we talked about increasing hematocrit, right? So increasing hematocrit is a trade-off between how viscous your blood is versus how much oxygen you're getting. So Suresh asked, is there any effect of global warming on oxygen density in high elevations, and what may be its effect on migrating population? So yeah, the effect of global warming is that there is no effect of increasing temperatures on the availability of oxygen. So it doesn't matter if the temperature at the top of Mount Everest is 30 degrees Celsius, it'll still have this pretty much the same amount of oxygen. Very like basically no changes in availability of oxygen. And so that is going to be a big challenge for any animal, including humans, that are trying to colonize these big the high elevation habitats in the future. Do birds make use of body fat? So Govind Sudarshan asked, do birds make use of body fat? And yes, birds absolutely make of body fat, but you have to remember that body fat is for birds that live in cold areas or that have to fly around. Fat is a very sort of dangerous thing to have. If you have too much of it, that means you are spending more energy flying because you're heavier, right? And so birds that are resident typically try to minimize the amount of body fat they have in their body. Some birds that don't fly a lot actually have a lot of body fat. So penguins, for example, are a great example where they have subdermal fat all across their body, just like we do or pigs do. So penguins have bacon, for example, because they have a layer of body fat that is insulating them against the cold right underneath their skin. Most birds can't do that because that increases their body weight too much and makes their flying more inefficient. Ravi, I'll show you that last slide. How are water birds adapted? So Neeraj is asking how water birds have adapted their feathers. Quick answer is that they have adapted in two ways. One is they have really high what is called barb density, barb and barbule density. So those interlocked barbs that I talked about are very interlocked, and that's how they stay waterproof. And I want you to do this when you go next time and watch a diving bird, okay? And not a cormorant. So the cormorant is probably the most common diving bird that you see in India, but cormorants, as I'm sure some of you may know, don't have this waterproofness. They don't have prenoil, and so they don't have waterproof feathers. But if you go in the winter, especially if you live in North India, you can go see birds like tufted ducks, which are a diving duck, or you can see grebes. Grebes are also they're not ducks, but they're diving animals. So dabchicks or little grebes, you can watch this. Whenever a bird is outside the water, it is using its downy part of the feather to trap a little pocket of air, which it warms up with its body warmth and then holds it there, right, to stay warm. When a bird wants to dive, if it has a lot of air trapped under its feathers, it's going to pop right back up, right? It can't dive because that air gives it a lot of buoyancy. So what birds do is you will see them making this motion. They go up and they push out all the air out of their feathers and then dive in. And so next time you're watching a little grebe or a tufted duck, watch how it actually dives, how it pushes out all the air from its feathers before it dives, okay? Two very similar question by Neeraj. Arnav, you can email me any question that you want. I live in the States, of course, so it's difficult to converse over the phone. Why, Govin, you again, that's Govin's question about why tropical mountains have greater diversity is a question that people have been trying to answer for about 250 years now. And even before Charles Darwin, there was a guy called Alexander von Humboldt, and I encourage you to read about Alexander von Humboldt. He has been asking this. He was the first person to ask this question. And let me give you a quick, again, this is a very, as they say, quick and dirty answer. One is that tropical mountains have very high productivity, okay? So because they have very aseasonal climate, there is the winters are not very cold, the summers are not very hot. There is a lot of primary production, lots of insects, very high productivity in those tropical habitats. The second is that tropical habitats also have very little extinction. And so because tropical habitats have never been covered by glaciers like the northern temperate habitats have been in ice ages, there is very little extinction. And so what most scientists believe is that the high diversity of animals in the tropics in general and on tropical mountains in particular is because of this high productivity that allows for a lot of species to coexist, because there's so much energy and so much primary productivity that a lot of different species can coexist in the same habitat. But also because of this low extinction, species have just accumulated over time and have gone into these narrow niches that let them survive. So it's a combination of high productivity and low extinction rates that potentially drives high tropical mountain diversity. And I hope that made sense. How do birds manage with high viscous, low viscous blood in the same heart and veins? Is there any change? Yeah, so there's Ponras, there's a great paper by Jesse Williamson in the journal Ornithology last year, and it talks about this phenomenon. It's called what they call, Jesse and Chris Witt call, elevational niche shift migration, and they specifically talk about the sort of the variation in or changes in physiology that the birds have to bring about twice a year, every year, to adapt to high elevations and low elevations in their wintering and summer habitats. Okay, so I encourage you to read Williamson and Witt 2020 or 2021. You said that high elevation birds have high MCHC. Are these levels within normal ranges? So Mark, the hemoglobin concentration for birds is a little higher than that for humans. Hemoglobin concentration, the highest hemoglobin concentration was 19 milligrams per deciliter that I measured. So it's pretty high. It's about 20% higher than most humans have. And so but they go from between 13 mg per deciliter to about 19 mg per deciliter. Do Himalayan birds also use torpor? So Janvi, your question is absolutely right, and I hope that you can answer that. I hope you can go and study Himalayan birds and tell us if they use torpor. We assume that some birds use torpor, but there's very little experimental physiology that has been done on Himalayan birds in India, and I encourage you to go study that. Mudassir is from Ladakh and is asking you, migratory birds first prepare themselves for build-up of RBC for short time, as we see lots of migratory birds stayed in Ladakh for a few days. Yeah, well, we don't know that, Mudassir. That's a great question again, and it would be great to understand how how quickly these changes arise. So typically, when humans are trying to scale a very high mountain, you have to go and acclimatize for about 2 weeks. So humans have a erythropoietic response that takes 2 weeks for full expression. So if you're going to climb Mount Everest, for example, you go to the base camp and stay there for 2 full weeks to then start climbing slowly. And then again, you go to a higher elevation, come back, you go to a higher elevation, stay there for a couple of days, let your body acclimatize. And birds potentially do that also. And so, but we just don't understand how well they do it, how long it takes for them to produce those RBCs. Yakin, that's right. Small birds have longer feathers in both high and low elevations. I'm guessing you meant altitudes when you said alterations. Does an increase in elevation lead to greater size of bird? That's a great question, Govin. And it's not true, unfortunately. There's no relationship worldwide between body size and elevation, which just means that there's a trade-off, right? There's a trade-off for having large body size at high elevations. Large body size means you have to eat more, and in the winter at high elevations in many mountains, there is very little to eat. So it is better to be a small bird at high elevations in the winter in some ways. Is there any difference between feathers of male and female resident Himalayan species? No, there were no differences by sex. Has any anthropogenic inferences caused any effects of change, successive generations, like pollution, deforestation? Lakshmi, those are again questions that are very broad. There are we don't know. Well, in some ways we do know that bird song changes and bird physiology to some extent changes. Bird stress ecology changes with deforestation and pollution, but we don't know. Like, if you had, maybe you can ask me a more specific question. Yeah, thanks, Rahul, for helping answer the question for why tropical mountains have higher diversity. Hi, everyone, we're new now. Okay, perfect. So, are there any questions that I should answer? Sure. Okay, I can quickly answer that last question, Chithi.
Cool. Sure.
Yeah. So Suresh asked, how do newly hatched chick manage hypoxia? And it actually begins before the chick is born. And we again, this is something we don't know, and you could study, is how eggs manage hypoxia, right? Because the shell of the egg has a lot of pores in it that allow for the oxygen to go in and carbon dioxide to go out. But if you increase the size of the pore of those eggs to let in more oxygen, then the shell becomes more brittle and can break easily, but also more water can escape, and the embryo inside can desiccate. And so we don't know actually how eggshell structure varies with elevation. And I know someone who is studying that for Andean birds, but there are lots of good collections of Himalayan bird eggs in museums around the world. And I encourage you to come to US or go to other places and study eggshells. Okay, so
Thanks a lot, Sahas. I think it was a super fun session, and with a lot of anecdotes and analogies as well, with the Tenzing Pushtits and Hillary Robbins. That was really nice. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us also today. And if there are any further questions, please post them on the discussion forum, and we will get them to Sahas so that he can answer them for you. And please feel free to reach out to Sahas as well via email.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah.